We'll go to our next speaker now, which is Kathleen Lowrey. Kathleen Lowrey is going to talk, is an anthropologist who has done most of her fieldwork in lowland Bolivia. She's still an associate professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, but in 2020 was dismissed from an administrative position following a campaign by students, faculty, and administrators who wanted her punished for refusing to adhere to gender ideology. Her faculty union is sustaining an ongoing fight on her behalf regarding this dismissal. Kathleen has written about gender ideology and trans activism for the feminist outlets Feminist Current, Gender Dissent, and 4W. And thank you so much, Kathleen. And Kathleen's talk today is Gynepology, the Anthropology of Women. So over to you.
So gynepology is not, it's not kind of a real word. It's a word that I've made up to think about what would anthropology look like if we kind of told the human story through women. So there was a fluorescence of this. I feel like I'm going to shrink myself up there. Yeah, I'm not sure if you guys can see, but there was a fluorescence of interest at looking at the human story through women in the 1970s. So this is the cover of an edited volume. I think it was actually published in 1981, but I believe it's the kind of proceedings of a conference that responded to an earlier conference called Man the Hunter. And then a group of scholars, mostly women scholars, came together and thought, well, what if we looked at what women are up to? Many of you probably know that studies have shown that in hunter-gathering societies, women's gathering actually provides most of the calories, although men's hunting is exciting because people like meat. Anyway, so there was a lot of interesting work in the 1970s. And then it began to be quashed by the 1980s. So this is something one sees in the feminist movement, one sees in scholarship generally, and it definitely happened in anthropology also. A really famous essay that I think did part of this work of squashing was an essay called the Cyborg Manifesto, or A Manifesto for Cyborgs, by an anthropologist named Donna Haraway. And it ends by saying, though both are bound in the spiral dance, I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. Now, this essay has become interpreted as a sort of feminist anthropologist embracing technology, despite understanding that technology is problematic, that it seems to come out of a masculine patriarchal world, but women can't reject technology. So this sort of modern progressive feminism. And I think what's been lost in that is how much Donna Haraway was really kicking a feminist tradition that had begun to emerge in the 1970s right in the teeth. So Donna Haraway is a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She wrote this essay in the early 1980s. In the late 1970s, there had been a major conference at Santa Cruz. I believe it was called Women and the Goddess. Carol Christ, who some of you may be aware of, she died not so long ago, was a major figure in this. So there's a way in which, with this essay, Donna Haraway was really stiff-arming that kind of work. Now, we can in some ways see the consequences of, was that good or was that bad? I mean, definitely, I would say most anthropologists think the kind of feminism that Donna Haraway articulates is feminist anthropology. I think Donna Haraway was part of feminist anthropology really losing its way, and one can see where we are now. So some of you may have heard a recent study came out saying that they'd done a restudy of women's practices in traditional societies, and they said it turns out in 80% of societies that we looked at, women actually do a lot of hunting. This is just not true. And for those of you who are interested, you can text me in the chat and I can send you a link to the debunking of this. But what's disturbing about that kind of study is it's a study that wants to sort of sets whatever men do as the standard of humanity, and then says like, women do that thing too, which I think that's just not feminism. That's not pro-woman to kind of say, whatever men do, women also do that thing, and we fit into that category, that we've lost our way if that's what we're doing. Another example of how anthropology has lost its way is, some of you may have come across this book, Feminism Against Family by Sophie Lewis. Sophie Lewis is a big fan of Donna Haraway. Donna Haraway blurbed Sophie Lewis's book. So in this book, what she's advocating for is what she calls full surrogacy now. In the acknowledgments to the book, Sophie Lewis is married to a man who identifies as a woman, and she calls that man, she thanks him for being her soul, which is just so pathetic. I mean, the most surrendered of Christian wives still thinks she has her own soul, but Sophie Lewis thinks her husband, who identifies as a man, is her soul. And in the book, she refers to pregnant women as gestators, and she says, well, right now there's a problem with surrogacy because of economic inequality, but really what we need to do is we just need to pay surrogates better for the work of baby making, and we need to distribute the work of baby making more equitably. And of course, we also have to distribute the babies more equitably, so people shouldn't be raised by there. It's just completely grotesquely misogynist, but this is what now counts as feminist anthropology. All right, we can also see this in popular culture. So girl power being modeled on male violence, which I think is what motivates that study, like, women are traditionally hunters too. These fantasies of what would it look like to have strong women, and what it looks like is women who engage in male violence. I haven't seen The Woman King, but my daughter watched it on a flight, and I watched part of it over her shoulder. And Viola Davis is in great shape in the movie, but there's scenes where she like totally kicks ass of men that are 20 years younger than her and twice her size. It's just ludicrous. And of course, it's also ludicrous that if you were going into battle, this is not armor, right? Something that like shows your cleavage and your belly. I don't need to tell this crowd about that. And girls are really propagandized with this. I don't know if anybody has watched the trailer for this new movie, Bottoms, that's supposed to be like, it's a groovy lesbian movie for teen girls. It's so horrible. The plot of the movie is two teenage girls start a fight club, which is, I mean, of course, like what else would teenage girls want to do but start a fight club? And the reason they start the fight club is because they want to seduce the hot chick. I mean, it's basically a teen boy sex movie with girls slotted in to the traditional gross, sniggering teen boy sex movie roles. The women who produced and directed it, they're at least in their late 20s, if not, they're not teenagers. You all know all about teen girls being propagandized with trans joy. So this, I don't need to tell this crowd that feminism has kind of lost its way. Feminist scholarship has lost its way. Feminist anthropology has lost its way. But this is not a depressing talk. This is a cheerful talk. So hope is on the way, and some of the hope is coming from unexpected corners. So 1970s feminists were rightly wary of evolutionary explanations. This was the era of Eio Wilson's sociobiology. Since his death, Eio Wilson has been recast as this like cuddly grandpa figure. His vision of evolution was really obsessed with violence and death. It was super sexist and misogynist. He was a professional entomologist. Supposedly he was a bug lover, but this supposed bug lover, one of his really famous early experiments was surrounding a mangrove island in Florida and dousing it with pesticide until every single critter on it died, and then seeing how it got repopulated. I think if you were a biologist who loves life, you would have designed a different kind of experiment. Anyway, to go specifically to anthropology, the sort of traditional account of hominin evolution is the so-called Savannah Hypothesis, that are kind of the primate ancestors who evolved into humans. They used to be break-eaters who lived in trees, and then there was a period of drought, and they had to come down from the trees and learn to live on the savanna. And a central part of this story is that humans developed bipedalism because they started to hunt. They became persistence hunters, which means it's a hunting method where you run critters down over several days. You're not faster than them, but you keep chasing them until they become exhausted and kind of collapse. Then you bash them on the head. This is something that has been practiced into modern times by some hunter-gathering groups. So it's not that this hunting adaptation doesn't exist, but the notion that it was at the center of how we became bipedal, how we acquired our big brains. This is a particular story, and it's a story that says we were lean, mean hunting machines on an arid savanna. Life was really hard. Thank God and it was mostly the men doing this persistence hunting. Thank God for them, because they caught enough meat, and then they dragged that meat back home, and their mates were like, oh, sweetie, you're the best. Please give me some meat. And like the women and children just sat on the savanna waiting for the meat to be, everybody has come across this story. It is still the mainstream story in anthropology. However, an old alternative is currently winning new support, and this is exciting, and I think something that feminists should be aware of. Many of you probably know Elaine Morgan's work. If you don't and you're interested in this kind of thing, you should read it. Her first book was The Dissent of Woman, published in 1972. She articulates what she called the Aquatic Ape Hypothesis, which I'll explain in a second. She wasn't the first to put it forward. The first was a guy named Alistair Hardy, who made it public in 1960. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. Elaine Morgan, who had read a ton of these sort of Savannah Hypothesis stories and saw a lot of holes in these stories and was extremely annoyed by those holes, then wrote The Dissent of Woman. In response, the book is hilarious. It remains a terrific, terrific read. She did make some scientific errors in it, and because she continued to develop what she called the Aquatic Ape Hypothesis pretty much for the rest of her life. She wrote their subsequent books, The Descent of the Child, The Scars of Evolution. There's a book called The Aquatic Ape Hypothesis. This book became very famous. It was very widely read, and then she got really attacked. And she continued to respond to kind of new scientific development. She responded to criticisms of some of the errors she had made. So the later books are also good reads, but they're written in a more serious tone. So if you just want to get the overall overview, understanding that it does have some mistakes in it, Dissent of Woman remains the entertaining kind of go-to read. But I will say within professional anthropology, the Aquatic Ape Hypothesis was long treated as just crazy. So as equivalent to saying that aliens built the pyramids, that kind of really nutty, out there idea. However, and I would say mostly outside of anthropology, a lot of evidence has been accumulating that the Aquatic Ape Hypothesis might in fact be correct. It's no longer called the Aquatic Ape Hypothesis. That's become untouchable because so much scorn was heaped on it. There's a 2016 BBC Radio 4 show, The Waterside Ape with David Attenborough. It's a 2-part radio show. You can listen to it in the car. It's great. I highly recommend it. I cannot summarize all of the evidence that it presents today, but if you're interested, seriously, it's very interesting. You'll really enjoy it. But I want to go through some of the stuff these researchers have been finding. So one of the things they've been very interested in is fat. So fat was at the heart of the Aquatic Ape Hypothesis. Alistair Hardy was a physiologist, and he had been on an expedition as a young man where they dissected aquatic sea mammals, and he noticed that they have blubber under their skins. They have this tightly bonded fat layer under their skins. And human beings also have fat tightly bonded to our skins, which is chimpanzees and apes don't have that. So our closest primate relatives don't have that. When Alistair Hardy saw that, he was like, I wonder if one of the things that has made human primates so different from other primates is, did we go through an aquatic stage in our development? But he said himself, he was like, I knew if I said this, I would be treated as a loony. So he waited until quite late in his career. He gave a talk about it in 1960. Elaine Morgan heard about that talk and was like, oh, that's a really interesting idea. And then she really ran with it. Okay, so part of the reason anthropologists are not that interested in this is anthropologists mostly study bones because, or archaeologists, physical anthropologists, because bones are what preserves well. Like bones are what you find. You don't find fat existing, a million years later. You find bones when you're lucky. But other kinds of scientists are interested in fat. So Stephen Cunnane, who wrote Survival of the Fattest, which is such a great book title, he's a physiologist at the University of Sherbrooke. He works on brain nutrition and aging, but he's been interested in the aquatic ape hypothesis since he was as an undergraduate. And he says, the human brain is enormously energetically costly, and it requires certain inputs to build. So the one that's probably most familiar to us is iodine. So now we all have iodized salt. Until we had iodized salt, people could get goiters, and there was a kind of, it had a horrible 19th century name, some like iodine-based cretinism, but a lack of iodine could cause certain kinds of developmental delay. Anyway, Stephen Cunnane points out that to build a fat brain was an evolutionary stage that required particularly kinds of inputs, and these would have been most lavishly available in fish and shellfish. So it just says it makes sense that when we sort of became different, when we became hominins, it makes sense that we would have been living in an environment that allowed us to do that. So humans are fat critters, and that fat is different. I already talked about how it's differently distributed. It's under our skin. Other primates, their fat is around their internal organs. Our brain is the fattiest organ in our bodies, and our babies are very different from other primate babies. So our babies are very, very chubby. So when we look at a gorilla baby, we think it's cute, but we also think it's a little bit disturbing looking because it's so skinny. All right. Morgan had pointed out early on that a lifestyle involving wallowing, swimming, diving is a calorically permissive lifestyle. So she has this great line about water is the only environment in which it costs nothing to be built like a tank. So she, hippopotamuses have an entirely vegetarian diet, but they're enormous because they require fewer calories to build that big fat body. Aquatic environments are rich in brain food. So what if the origin of the human evolutionary story is not in a context of kind of lean, mean scarcity, but in a context of rich abundance? Well, this changes the way we think about ourselves in a general way. And just to be clear, the waterside ape hypothesis or the aquatic ape hypothesis doesn't say where we went through a stage where we lived like dolphins. It says we went through a stage where we had a kind of hippopotamus-like lifestyle. We were still terrestrial creatures, but we spent a lot of time in the water. So other new research emerging right now. There's a woman named Erika Chagaté. She's a physiologist at Mid-Sweden University. She's tons of publications. And she's really interested in the diving capacity of humans. She suggests it puts us in the range of aquatic mammals like otters and seals. She studied competitive freedivers competitive freediving, it's so weird that freediving is even possible. That's something that's a recently developed modern sport, but she's also studied human communities that dive a lot for seafood. She hasn't actually worked with a group you may know about, the famous women pearl divers of Korea and Japan. But humans have an unusual capacity to dive deep, spend a lot of time underwater, and the capacities of men and women in this regard seem to be similar. So the record holders in competitive freediving are mostly men, but it's unlike in other sports, men and women's capacities seem to be less stiff. This seems to be a general capacity of human beings. Now, Elaine Morgan had pointed out that voluntary breath control is key to something else that's unique about humans that separates us from our nearest primate relatives, which is that we have speech. One of the things that we've learned about Coco the gorilla is a famous example. Coco learned sign language, and turns out Coco's pretty smart. She can even make jokes in sign language. So their brains are not as big as ours, but their cognitive capacity isn't that different. You can never teach them to speak, though, because they can't voluntarily control their breath. Asking them to learn to speak would be like asking us to pound out a message in Morse code with our hearts. Our heartbeat is not under our voluntary control. Why do we have voluntary breath control? Well, Morgan suggests it's because we went through a stage where we spent a lot of time swimming and diving. Okay. So the upshot is that human evolutionary just so stories have tended to emphasize constraints, scarcity, limits, competition. This lean, mean guy was a fighting machine on the Pleistocene savanna. We should all be eating the paleo diet so we can be skinny. Some of you may have heard about the Liver King who is lying about his diet. Anyway, but evolution does act in response to constraints, but it also acts in response to possibilities, to openings, to opportunities. Okay, now that's this next part. And Joe, how am I doing on time?
I'm not actually sure because I've just been listening so intently. I haven't looked at the time. It's 7 past. I think you could go on for another, say, 10 minutes. That would be all right.
I'm good. I can do what I want to do in that amount of time. Thank you. I never know if I've babbled too much.
Yeah.
So this isn't specifically related to the aquatic ape hypothesis, but there's a question about human evolution is what was the elementary family unit? The Savannah Hypothesis supposes that it's man the hunter and his mate and offspring who are like hanging out waiting for their gifts of meat. What if the elementary family unit is a nice chubby granny, her daughters, and their fat babies? So the grandmother hypothesis was first put forward in Kirsten Hawkes in 1997. She had worked with Hadza communities these are hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And she noticed that Hadza grandmothers put a tremendous amount of work into feeding and caring for their grandchildren. So she did like caloric studies, like how many calories are provided by, and it turns out grandmas were providing a lot of calories to grandchildren and also doing a lot of care work. Now she thought about this and she was like, this may be an answer to the evolutionary puzzle of menopause, human menopause, which is something else that separates us from our nearest primate relatives. The blunt question is, why don't women just die after we stop being able to reproduce? I'm sure many a man has asked this question, and menopause is often portrayed as like this sort of sad face, like, now you're useless, but you're still alive. And our nearest primate relatives keep having babies into old age. The grandmother hypothesis, I have to say, as much as I think anthropology is a mess in many ways, the grandmother hypothesis now enjoys wide support in anthropology. So what the grandmother hypothesis suggests is it says, and this goes to the facts that the world is currently in denial about the differences between men and women, the organizations of their bodies and their life strategies around different kinds of gamete production. Men produce little gametes. And so if we think about reproductive fitness, their best evolutionary strategy is wide and shallow. So it's possible for them to father most men don't, most men, I won't get into it, but this is a possible evolutionary strategy for men, right? Invest in their offspring, but they investing in your offspring and trying to have as many offspring as possible is a reasonable reproductive fitness strategy for men. Women are the large gamete producers. We gestate the babies, and our babies are very costly to produce. We spend a lot of time, like the last part of pregnancy is just laying fat on your baby, and then the baby gets born and it can't do a damn thing, right? It has this super floppy head where chimpanzee and gorilla babies, as soon as they're skinny, as soon as they're born, they can cling to their moms, they can hold their heads up. Human babies just lay there, really. And so we need help to raise our babies. If we're going to continue to eat ourselves, feed our babies, somebody has to be helping us. The Savannah hypothesis was like, it's the man, which of course it is to some extent. But actually, it's probably grandma who's mostly helping. It's not, we can't mother dozens of children, right? It's our best evolutionary strategy is to really do a good job with the number of children we're able to have. And the grandmother strategy is you spend part of your life kind of forwarding your genetic inheritance, supporting your genetic inheritance in the form of helping your daughters raise their babies. And maybe in 2 generations, maybe helping to raise your great granddaughters. And that's probably facilitated the specifically human adaptations of how did we evolve a strategy that's like, oh my God, have a fat baby with a floppy head that it can't hold up. And we humans are unusual in that we allow others to help baby raising. Gorilla and chimpanzee moms just try to touch their babies. They'll chew your arm off. For the first 6 months, the only reason that another gorilla or chimpanzee would want to touch your baby is because they want to kill it. We share parenting. Okay, so I wanted to say so many other things, but for time, I'm just going to skip to the end at this point. This is to go back to, so the grandmother hypothesis has nothing to do with the waterside ape hypothesis, except maybe it does, because one interesting fact is that there are very few other mammals who experience menopause. Orcas, famously, a few other sea mammal species. These are creatures who are very smart. Their offspring have an extended juvenile period, and they live in what are called matriarchal pods of grandma, daughters, and grandchildren. So grannies and aunties have a kind of shared reproductive strategy of helping to raise babies. And it's just interesting that these are smart, playful, blubbery critters who live in water. I'm just saying. Okay, so let me skip way ahead. I'm not going to talk about any of this. Okay, to wrap up, I just want to point out the human story could be told another way. And there are reasons to believe evidence is accumulating in favor of this alternative human story actually being the human story. So we evolved under conditions of abundance, of watery playfulness, not of hardscrabble aridity. Fat was important. Grandmas, aunties, and of course, mums was important. And all of these features are kind of the soft bits of human evolution. It's not the fault of like the patriarchy that fat doesn't preserve well in the archaeological record, but it has biased. We've paid a lot of attention to bones and stones. We haven't paid attention to fat. We haven't paid attention to fiber technologies, which I'm not going to talk about today. So the erasure of women that we see in policy today has also happened in scholarship. I think it began around the same time because I think these ideas were burbling up in the 1970s and then they were squashed and now they're like coming back. So these erasures can't be sustained in the face of evidence. We're seeing it start to crumble and hooray, it's exciting. Okay, thanks so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to be here. And that's it from me.